Hi. We enter into a new chapter today, 1 Samuel 20, a long chapter, and one that is unusual in a number of ways. It involves only David and Jonathan, and it involves David's only time he speaks to Jonathan in the entire book, which may surprise us because the scholars have explored, as we've seen already, how close they were and how much Jonathan professes his love for David, as he will do as well in this scene as he will do another time. They certainly enter into a covenant here, and they'll either renew the covenant or enter into another one in chapter 23. And David will speak here, but he won't speak much, and then Jonathan will speak the rest of the way. So these words down here where David says to Jonathan at the end of the scene we'll look at today, "Who will tell me if your father answers you harshly?" is the last words that David says to the living Jonathan. But he will speak over his and his father's dead bodies at the beginning of the next book in 2 Samuel. So as we've been looking at, we see the key words here. In addition to the key words, we also have the fact that the author uses here something that happens regularly in Hebrew, but it's concentrated here as another way of getting attention, which is to say the doubling of words, or especially verbs. Often those are translated, for example, here it says angry, yes, angry, and it could often be translated as very angry or extremely angry. That's the general idea, is that the double use of a verb uses one as an intensifier. But that's often, the doubling is often missed in translation because it's awkward in English, but I wanted to highlight it here because this chapter is all about doubling. It's all about the pair of David and Jonathan and their relation to Saul, and who are they brothers? Are they sons of the same father or not? And as we'll see later, the question is really going to be clear to Saul, who repeatedly refers to David as son of Jesse in the final scene in this chapter. So later we'll see Saul, but in this first part it's only David and Jonathan. In the first scene we'll see here, it's only Jonathan speaking here. It's only Jonathan speaking here, and then finally down here when Jonathan takes his place at the table with his father, then Saul will speak and David will be spoken about. So it's a long chapter. It'll take us several videos to go through it, but we'll start here in our first section. And part of what's at issue, in addition to the things that are obvious from the key words, the question of Saul's fatherhood, both to Jonathan and David, is the question of the monarchy in relation to family. And this isn't just the personal and political question we've been looking at since chapter 18, which is to highlight that we don't have to make a choice between whether Jonathan and David's relationship is an emotionally loving, connected one or a political one. It can certainly be both. But here there's another issue about that. There's the question of the relationship with this growing monarchical establishment, which, as I've noted, in Saul's situation, there's no formal institutions that have been named. That only really begins under David and then is consolidated under Solomon, when we hear a whole chapter in the book of 1 Kings just listing all his officials and their responsibilities. So at this point, Saul is simply a local guy who's been made king in the city of Gibeah, and yet his power is not clear exactly whether everybody's with him. We've already seen a couple of times that the people sided with Jonathan around the question of the honey, and they prefer David. The women in the street prefer David to Saul. So part of what's at issue is going to be the relationship between the family lineages, the mishpacha, which is the clan lineages, the loyalty there, and the loyalty to the king. And over time, we'll see that the language of clan loyalty is diminished and the language of monarchical loyalty is intensified as Israel and Judah become a fully institutionalized monarchical state by the time we get to the books of Kings. So this scene right here is the beginning of the process of noting those tensions before the tensions slip over and are all in the control of the monarchy. Although never completely that way. There's always some remnant authority within the families, as we'll see if we get through the entire books of Kings as we go. So the scene begins with David fleeing from Naioth and Ramah, and we noted last time that he was there leaving Saul, and that's where Samuel was, and yet Saul came and was found among the prophets here, and so now that David sees Saul among the prophets, even though we didn't hear that Saul ever found David, he flees from Ramah and came before Jonathan. It doesn't say exactly where, but we have to assume that this is in Gibeah, in the hometown of Saul and Jonathan. Notice that literally here it's before his face, and that's That's another element I've translated it that way here, as we've been highlighting in chapters 18 and 19. The New Revised Standard, as many translations, often excise the Hebrew language of body parts in terms of relationships. So before somebody's face, or speaking in their ears, or seeing their eyes, or using their hands, are all things that Hebrew uses to describe that. And I've tried to translate those as literally as I can as here, so you can discover those if your translation doesn't show them. So he literally came before Jonathan's face, and we see the fleeing and coming we saw in 19:18, and then we'll see it again in the next chapter. And he asks, "What have I done?" He asks three questions here. What have I done? What is my guilt? And what is my sin against your father that he is trying to take my life? And if we've been listening carefully, we will note that this phrase, "What have I done?" is a refrain that echoes through the story of David. And let's look at that here. That forms a roughly chiastic shape here. It's not exactly a chiasm in the sense that the parts in green here, the B parts, don't match exactly. It's David and Jonathan on one side and Saul and David on the other. But I hope you can see the pattern here of the first one that we saw in the context of Goliath showing up and young David being challenged by his brother Eliab. And David says to him, "What have I done?" It was only a question. Then the passage that we're on right now, where David comes before Jonathan and asks, "What have I done?" Jonathan will speak on David's behalf later in the chapter to his father Saul and ask, "What has he done?" David will say it directly to Saul way later in chapter 26. "What have I done? What guilt is on my hands?" Very similar to here. So the connection of what have I done and my guilt makes it a part of a chiasm as well, only in the green parts, the B parts. And then finally, in the context of the Philistines again in chapter 29, when David was working for the Philistines and Lord Ashish tells him to go back, and he asks, "What have I done?" So in 5 different contexts, David leads to the question before his audience in the book and before the audience of the book, "What have I done?" And really, that's going to be the question throughout, along with the question of who am I, what have I done, are the questions about David. Was what he has done to become a great king, is what he's done to bed Bathsheba and have his family just be destroyed, or some of all of those things, as we'll see. So what is my sin? What is my guilt? Echoing in 28, as we'll see, 20 verse 8. And what is my sin against your father? Notice that Jonathan challenged his father earlier around the question of why would you sin against an innocent man? And so he had said, Jonathan acknowledged that David had not sinned against him, so there was no reason for Saul to sin against David. And now David asked that question, but it's only a rhetorical question because Jonathan's not interested in engaging in theological or moral debate. He's interested in trying to save David's life. So, what is my sin against your father that he's trying to take my life? And notice we've gone back and forth with this, that Jonathan understood that Saul was trying to take his life and talked him out of it, but then an evil spirit from Yahweh came upon him again. But after that, a good spirit, or at least the spirit of Yahweh, of Elohim, came upon him, and he was counted among the prophets. So that's the last thing we saw, and yet David is sure that he's still trying to take his life. So that's the perspective, and Jonathan demurs, and in very strong language. Far from it, using the word halilah, as Falcom notes, the strongest word of defense available to him, and he will use it again in a few verses in verse 9, which points out that many people see a chiasm in this first section here. Falcom highlights a very detailed chiasm, and I won't do that now because I think it's more of a distraction. But if you can see in our unit here, the way the beginning part and the end part mirror each other in many ways, the question of your father and your father, the question of the doubling of knowing here are in both parts. So there's certainly a framework here, and the far from it here and up here are certainly part of that. It's not highlighted here because it's only used twice. It's not really a key word. But this opening section and this closing section certainly echo. So he says, "You shall not die. My father does nothing, either great or small, without disclosing it to me." How well does Jonathan really know his father? Is that really true? And notice he says that, but then he asks again, is this a rhetorical question or not? And why should my father hide this from me? Never. So he begins and ends with strong imperative statements, literally, ein Zoth, not this. So far from it and not this. And yet, maybe David knows Jonathan's father Saul better than Jonathan knows him himself, because we as readers certainly know that he is planning to kill him and has disclosed it. So let's look at some of the details here. My father does nothing here, literally makes no word, and the Hebrew davar for word is 3 times in this verse. So that's another way that that the translation often covers up the way the Hebrew works. Great or small here, where later in chapter 22, Saul reverses Jonathan's expectation and in terms of great or small, without disclosing it to me, literally without opening my ear, or I put here without uncovering my ear. Uh, so he expects that his father speaks things into his ear as he speaks things into David's ear. But as Barbara Green notes below, by asking that question, Jonathan admits the possibility that David's charge may in fact be true. So notice the hiding theme here, that his father's hiding it from him, and just as David will try to be hiding from his father. So David also swore, which is to say, as Saul swore earlier in 19:6, but at Jonathan's behest. But there'll be more swearing at the end of the chapter, and that's part of what leads Falkman to see the entire chapter as a chiasm in great detail. But we won't look at that here right now either. Your father knows well, which is one of the key words you see highlighted, the question of knowing. As Polzin notes below, chapters 20 to 23, those 4 chapters contain over 1/3 of all the occurrences of this root word in the entire book. So out of the 31 chapters in the book, the third of the uses are in 4 chapters, which is roughly an eighth of the entire book. So a concentration of the question of knowing here. And the Hebrew yada, knowing, has sexual connotations. It's certainly so from the Genesis story. The Adam knew his woman and she became pregnant. And so knowing can have a sexual connotation, and that may be something of what's going on here between David and Jonathan. But it's also general intimate knowledge, not just a euphemism for sexuality, but knowing each other well, and that's what's at issue here. So David swore, which is say takes an oath here. Your father knows well that you like me, or literally that you charm my eyes. A figure of speech again lost in translation. Notice he doesn't say that you love me, which is the word that the narrator has used several times so far. So that you charm my eyes, and he thinks, or literally he says, but as Bodder knows, David claims to know the inner workings of Saul's mind, which is an interesting claim, and Jonathan doesn't argue about it. Do not let Jonathan know this, or he will be grieved. But truly, as Yahweh lives and as you yourself live, there is but a step between me and death. So David presents a counter scenario to Jonathan, that Saul, yes, indeed, is intending to kill David, but is now hiding it from him, even though earlier he demanded that he do it. He and Saul's fellow servants do it. So David is suggesting that at this point, that Saul knows that if Jonathan finds out, he'll at least be grieved, if not do what he's going to do, which is help prevent it from happening, which he's already done once, and he's going to do with an extremely complicated little story here that we'll see. So, but a step between me and death, Pesa, only here in the Masoretic text uses a verb in Isaiah 27. So Jonathan gets a chance to speak back here, and really this is the summary of the whole thing. As Diana Edelman says, he has now symbolically become David's armor bearer by saying, whatever you say, I will do for you. In other words, you are my boss. I am your servant, just as Jonathan had a servant when he went into the battle of Mishmash Pass back in 1 Samuel 14. Now Jonathan basically becomes David's servant. So David says to Jonathan, tomorrow is the new moon, Chodesh, which is just generally the word for moon, or the word for months, but it's 5 times in this section, so we highlight it as a key word. And for some reason I can't understand, the New RSV translates in a double negative here what the Hebrew translates positively. I should not fail to sit with the king at the meal, but the Hebrew has, I must sit. So why they would reverse that to a double negative, I don't know. But the requirement that as a member of the court, he must sit at this festival, which we don't know much about, because again, we can't assume any knowledge of new moon festival, say from Leviticus in this time period. But there's some kind of festival, and we don't know if it's just a royal festival or it's a family festival, because in a moment, David will make the request that he has to go back to his family to participate in the festival. So David's saying to Jonathan, tomorrow's a new moon, and I have to be there, but let me go so I may hide in the field until the 3rd evening. And as my note below suggests, is David really saying he's going to be in the field for 3 days? He was a shepherd by training, and shepherds spend a lot of time in the field, as Jacob says to Laban, a story that's not very far in the background here, of what life is like in the fields. It's hot in the summer, and it's cold in the winter, and when sleep escaped his eyes. So David identifying perhaps with his ancestor Jacob that he certainly doesn't know about, since the book of Genesis is certainly written later. But be that as it may, there's certainly an echo there for readers who know both. So he offers a choice here. If your father misses me at all, another doubled verb here, misses, yes, misses, and another one here, which is a double asking, because the word for ask is sha'al. So David asked, yes, asked, leave of me. Notice this is David saying to Jonathan that Jonathan should say to Saul that David said this. So several layers of that in there. David asked me of leave to run to Bethlehem, a city that we last heard of in chapter 17, where David had come from the house of Jesse to see the story with Goliath and be engaged in that. Run to a city, for there's a yearly sacrifice there for the family. And now, in addition to Genesis echoes, we're getting Exodus echoes. And that shouldn't be too surprising, because in my book, Come Out My People, I argue that the story of the Exodus is a story written as a counter story to the David, Solomon, and Rehoboam story, where the three unnamed pharaohs in the chapters of Exodus represent respectively David, Solomon, and Rehoboam. So if that's the case, Saul isn't one of the symbolic pharaohs from the book of Exodus, but there's certainly echoes here. Explicitly here from Exodus, say 10:25, where Moses says to Pharaoh, you must also let us have sacrifices and burnt offerings to sacrifice to Yahweh our God, which echoes something earlier from chapter 5 as well, from Exodus 5 as well, when Moses first proposed that the Israelites go out into the wilderness to celebrate a sacrifice, but as a nation. Here it's for the family mishpachah, which recalls chapter 10. Let's look at that now to see the echo of this important word. So here, this is when the lot was taken. Saul, or they brought lots up to find who the king would be, and they brought them up by families, by mishpachah. So we saw that there, and we also saw it in chapter 18 here, immediately relevant to our scene. David said to Saul, who am I and who is my mishpachah? That my father's family in Israel here, Chaya Mishpachah, that I should be son-in-law to the king. So here David juxtaposed Mishpachah and the question of kingship. And now in our situation, out of David's mouth to be putting in Jonathan's mouth, to be putting in Saul's ear, is this alleged word from David, who knows of the tension that saying this word would be for Saul, who has told him that he cannot go back to his family anymore. So this is really parallel to the idea of the Israelites telling Pharaoh, go, we're going for a sacrifice, and what they really mean is they just want to get out of Dodge. And so he offers this choice. If he says good, which he certainly won't, it will be well. It'll be shalom with your servant, which is him speaking of himself in the third person. But if he was angry, another double here, angry, yes, angry, that we see here, then know that evil has been determined by him or has been completed. Therefore, so David having proposed that whole scenario, deal chesed to me. And this is the first time we're hearing hesed in this context. It was only used one other time in Samuel, and it's only in this chapter in all the books of Samuel. And yet it's 249 times in the Masoretic text, almost always an attribute of Yahweh. It's almost impossible to translate. Here, Newer Revised Standard has deal kindly or make loyalty, but sometimes it's translated covenant loyalty. But it has to do with the behavior of people within a covenant. So whether that's kindness or love or loyalty, all of those are fitting within it. But here, Yahweh is not a part of it. We'll see in the next scene in our chapter, Yahweh is a key character. But Yahweh is not mentioned here in this, except for implicitly here. Well, in the Hebrew, explicitly, implicitly in the translation. So therefore, do chesed with your servant, for you brought your servant into a covenant with Yahweh. There is no specific word for sacred here. It's literally a covenant for Yahweh. And so the reason it might be translated here is a covenant with Yahweh with you seems awkward. So I rendered it, as you can see here, a covenant with Yahweh and you, which is the point. But if there is guilt in me, going back to the question he rhetorically asked earlier, kill me yourself, why should you bring me to your father? And of course, Jonathan has no interest in killing David any more than Michal had an honest sense probably that David had a plan to kill her in the story that she said to Saul's servants. And Jonathan responds again with Halilah here. Far be it from me, if I knew that it was decided by my father that evil should come upon you, would I not tell you? And notice that Jonathan at this point is acknowledging he doesn't know. Well, he said in the beginning, if my father had planned this, he would have told me. But now he's acknowledging that he doesn't know. But at least he's saying that if he will find out, he would tell. And so he will not let David get killed. And then our scene ends here with David's last word to Jonathan in the entire book. David said to Jonathan, "Who will tell me if your father answers you harshly?" Using the word kasha, exactly like Pharaoh, exactly what Pharaoh did in treating the Israelites harshly. And Jonathan doesn't answer the question, but calls him out in the field, much like Cain called his brother Abel out in the field in Genesis 4. Plainly, I assume you know, and we know, that Jonathan is not taking David out into the field to kill him, but to save his life. And so we'll see how the plot continues with with Jonathan's plan for how to keep David close to him but far from his father in the next video. See you then for that. Bye-bye.